He was the architect of total war, the general who burned a path from Atlanta to the sea and broke the Confederacy's will to keep fighting. William Tecumseh Sherman commanded 100,000 men and never once flinched at the legends standing across from him. Not Joe Johnston, not the myth of Robert E. Lee. But one name got under his skin. It wasn't a West Point graduate. It wasn't a name with a Virginia pedigree behind it. It was a man who seemed to rise straight out of the swamps and backwoods of Tennessee, self-taught, moving with a speed that made no sense on paper. A logistical nightmare who threatened to unravel Sherman's entire strategy from behind his own lines. Sherman had a name for him. He called him that Devil Forrest. This is the story of how one brutal, brilliant cavalryman became the singular obsession of the most feared general the Union produced, and how the same man Sherman would later call the most remarkable soldier of the entire war left behind a legacy soaked in one of American history's darkest chapters. To understand why Sherman feared him, you have to understand where he came from, because almost nothing about Nathan Bedford Forrest suggested a future military legend. He was born in 1821 in a one-room cabin near Chapel Hill, Tennessee, the son of a blacksmith. His father died when Forrest was still a teenager, and it fell to him, the oldest son, to hold what was left of the family together. There was no academy waiting for him, no officer's commission handed down through a family name. What Forrest had instead was hunger and an instinct for reading people that no classroom could have taught him. He turned that instinct into money, first trading livestock, then real estate, and eventually, in the years leading up to the war, human beings. By 1861, Forrest was one of the wealthiest slave traders in Memphis, worth close to $1.5 million, a fortune built on a business even other slaveholders considered beneath them. He had every reason in the world to sit the war out. Instead, at 39 years old, with no military training whatsoever, he enlisted as a private. That didn't last long. Forrest used his own money to raise and equip an entire cavalry battalion, and within months, he wasn't a private anymore. He was a lieutenant colonel. By the end of the war, he'd risen all the way to lieutenant general, one of the very few men on either side to climb that far without a single day of formal military schooling behind him. This wasn't an aristocrat playing soldier. This was a self-made businessman applying a lifetime of cold, ruthless calculation to a battlefield, and it worked in a way that unsettled everyone who watched it happen. Forrest's approach to war broke almost every rule the professionals lived by. While trained officers thought in terms of formations and textbook maneuvers, Forrest thought in terms of speed, pressure, and psychological collapse. His own explanation for how he won so often was blunt to the point of crude. Get there first, with the most men. It sounds simple. It wasn't. It meant marching his cavalry harder and faster than anyone thought sustainable, striking before the enemy had finished digesting the fact that he was even in the area, then vanishing before reinforcements could arrive to punish him for it. Union soldiers started calling him the Wizard of the Saddle, and it wasn't meant as flattery so much as an admission that nobody could quite explain how he kept appearing where he wasn't supposed to be. His legend started early. At Fort Donaldson in February 1862, with the rest of the Confederate command preparing to surrender the fort to Ulysses S. Grant, Forrest refused to be part of it. He gathered his cavalry and rode out through freezing, waist-deep swampland rather than hand his men over as prisoners, escaping a trap that had just swallowed the rest of the garrison. 6 weeks later, he was already fighting again at Shiloh. It was the first sign of a pattern that would define the rest of his war. Forrest didn't retreat when the odds said he should. He attacked instead, and more often than the numbers had any right to allow, he came out on top. He wasn't easy for his own side to manage either. Forrest clashed bitterly with Confederate leadership throughout the war, men with formal training who resented taking orders from a former slave trader who'd never read a military textbook in his life. His feud with General Braxton Bragg came to a head after the Battle of Chickamauga in 1863, when Forrest confronted him directly over what he saw as a squandered victory, a Confederate army that had crushed the Union line and then failed to finish the job. Accounts of exactly what was said between them vary, but the outcome is clear.
Forrest demanded a transfer out from under Bragg's command and got it, and from that point on he operated with a level of independence almost no other Confederate cavalry officer enjoyed, answering to Richmond more than to any single general in the field. That freedom is a big part of what made him so hard to predict. Nobody was reining him in. Part of what set Forrest apart wasn't just strategy, it was that he fought like a soldier instead of commanding like an officer. He led from the front of his own charges over and over, in a way most generals by 1864 considered close to reckless. By his own account, he had somewhere around 30 horses shot out from under him during the war, and personally killed roughly 30 men in hand-to-hand combat, numbers impossible to verify with precision, but consistent with what the men who served under him described. In 1863, one of his own subordinates, a lieutenant named Andrew Wills Gould, shot him in a heated dispute over a battlefield reassignment. Wounded, Forrest chased the man down anyway and killed him with a knife, then reportedly paid for the medical treatment of the officer who'd shot him before he died of the wound days later. It sounds like exaggeration. Multiple accounts from soldiers who witnessed it back up the broad strokes. Whatever else people said about Forrest, nobody who served alongside him or fought against him ever doubted his nerve. By the summer of 1864, that reputation had grown into something closer to legend across the Western theater, and the kind of legend a Union general wants operating loose behind his own supply lines. Grant had already run into Forrest during the Vicksburg campaign and come away frustrated by how little he could pin him down. Now, Sherman, preparing to launch the most consequential campaign of his career, had an even bigger problem sitting behind him. He couldn't fight Forrest and take Atlanta at the same time, and Atlanta was the whole point. Sherman's anxiety over him wasn't vague unease, it was specific and it was constant, because Forrest's target wasn't Sherman's army directly, it was the single fragile railroad line running all the way back to Chattanooga that kept 100,000 Union soldiers fed, armed, and supplied. Cut that line and Sherman's campaign didn't just slow down, it starved. Sherman understood exactly what was at stake, and it meant he was fighting the war in Georgia while constantly looking back over his shoulder at Mississippi. When comparing him to other Confederate cavalry raiders operating in the region, men whose exploits made headlines but rarely threatened his actual strategy, Sherman drew a clear distinction. Forrest, he said, was simply a more dangerous man than any of them. That anxiety curdled into something close to obsession in June 1864. Sherman dispatched a force of roughly 8,000 men under Samuel Sturgis into Mississippi with a single explicit mission: find Forrest and destroy him before he could do any real damage. Forrest met them with about 3,500 men. On paper, it wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't, just not in the direction Sturgis expected. They collided at a crossroads in Mississippi, and what happened there is still studied as one of the great tactical performances of the entire war. Forrest reached the ground first, forced the Union cavalry into a fight before their infantry could catch up to support them, and then hit them with everything he had. The Union line didn't just break, it dissolved into a rout. Wagons, cannons, and supplies were abandoned in the chaos as Sturgis's men fled back the way they'd come. He'd lost roughly a sixth of his entire force. Forrest, badly outnumbered on paper, had just annihilated an army sent specifically to end him. Word of Brice's Crossroads reached Sherman while he was deep in Georgia, still grinding toward Atlanta, and his response has survived in his own words, written without any apparent restraint. That devil Forrest, he said, must be hunted down and killed if it costs 10,000 lives and bankrupted the federal treasury. There would be no peace in Tennessee, he added, until Forrest was dead. Read that again slowly. This was a general commanding one of the largest armies in American history, a man who would go on to burn Atlanta and march to the sea without losing his nerve once, declaring he'd sacrifice 10,000 of his own men to remove a single Confederate cavalry officer from the board. Sherman tried again almost immediately. He sent a second, much larger force after Brice's Crossroads, nearly 14,000 men under Andrew Jackson Smith, hoping raw numbers would finally settle the problem. They caught Forrest at Tupelo in July, and this time the Union troops held their ground and inflicted real losses on the Confederates. It wasn't the humiliation of Brice's Crossroads repeated, but it also wasn't the death blow Sherman needed. Forrest survived, regrouped, and kept raiding. Two separate armies, thrown at a man commanding a fraction of either one's strength, and neither had ended the threat. In September, with Atlanta already fallen, Forrest launched a raid straight into Tennessee, tearing up track and burning depots along the very railroad Sherman's entire campaign depended on. For a moment, it worked exactly as intended, forcing Sherman to divert troops and attention away from his next move. It's part of what pushed Sherman toward the decision that would define the rest of the war, cutting his army loose from its supply lines entirely and living off the land on the march to the sea, rather than staying tethered to a railroad Forrest could keep cutting behind him. Historians still debate exactly how much credit belongs to Forrest for forcing that call. The timing, at the very least, is hard to dismiss as coincidence. He wasn't finished after that raid either. In late October and early November, Forrest hauled artillery to the banks of the Tennessee River near Johnsonville and opened fire on the Union supply depot there, a hub packed with steamboats, barges, and warehouses of material meant to keep Sherman's forces running. Union crews, caught under fire and unable to move their vessels safely downriver, ended up burning several of their own boats just to keep them out of Confederate hands. By the time the smoke cleared, Forrest's artillery and the panic it triggered had destroyed a significant stretch of Union River supply using nothing but cavalry and cannon, no navy involved at all. Sherman himself later called it one of the most brilliant cavalry exploits of the entire war. Coming from the man who wanted him dead at nearly any cost, that's not a compliment he handed out lightly.
By the final winter of the war, Forrest had been given command of most of the remaining Confederate cavalry in the Western Theater. Promoted to lieutenant general in February 1865, the highest rank he'd ever hold, earned entirely on results rather than pedigree. It didn't change the outcome. The Confederacy was collapsing everywhere else, and no amount of tactical brilliance in Mississippi and Alabama could hold that back forever. In April 1865, Forrest fought his last major battle at Selma against a Union cavalry force nearly 3 times his size, commanded by James Wilson, a young officer who had studied Forrest's tactics closely and finally had the numbers and mobility to match him. Selma fell. It was, in its own way, the end of the myth that Forrest simply couldn't be beaten. He could. It just took the Union almost the entire war and an overwhelming advantage to prove it. The story of Nathan Bedford Forrest is a story with 2 legacies sitting on top of each other, one of battlefield brilliance and one of profound darkness, and neither one cancels the other out. The same man Sherman called the most remarkable soldier the war produced was also the commander responsible for one of its most horrifying atrocities, the massacre at Fort Pillow. In April 1864, months before Brice's Crossroads made his name a household word in the North, Forrest's troops overran a Union garrison at Fort Pillow on the Mississippi River. Part of that garrison was made up of soldiers from the United States Colored Troops, black men who had enlisted to fight for their own freedom. What happened after the fort was overwhelmed became one of the most disputed and horrifying episodes of the entire war. Union survivors and a federal investigation described men shot and bayoneted after attempting to surrender, a slaughter rather than a battle that had simply spiraled out of control. Confederate defenders and some later historians disputed the scale and intent behind what happened. What isn't in dispute is that the death toll among black soldiers at Fort Pillow was disproportionately, brutally high, and that Remember Fort Pillow became a rallying cry for black troops for the remainder of the war. Forrest commanded the men who did it. Whatever else he accomplished on a battlefield, that fact doesn't come off the record, and it can't be separated from the man who made Sherman nervous. The war ended for Forrest the way it ended for most Confederate commanders, in collapse, though even then he chose his own path rather than the easy one. Instead of formally surrendering his remaining troops alongside the other dissolving Confederate armies, he gathered them one final time, delivered a farewell address telling them the cause was lost and further resistance would only bring more suffering for nothing, and sent them home. If the story stopped there, Forrest might be remembered today purely as a battlefield anomaly, a self-taught tactician who terrified 2 of the Union's best generals without ever attending a single day of military school. It doesn't stop there. In 1867, Forrest became the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, an organization built largely by Confederate veterans and formed to terrorize black Southerners and roll back the political gains of Reconstruction through violence and intimidation. Forrest lent it his wartime prestige as the Wizard of the Saddle, giving the group its earliest structure and legitimacy.
He later claimed in testimony before Congress that he tried to disband the organization once it grew more violent than he intended, and historians remain divided on how much weight to give that claim. What's not disputed is that he accepted the role in the first place, and that the organization he helped shape left a legacy of terror stretching for generations after the war itself had ended. There's one more piece of the story that rarely makes it into either version of Forrest, the war hero or the Klan founder. In 1875, near the end of his life, Forrest gave a speech to a black civic organization in Memphis, accepting an invitation extended to him as a gesture of reconciliation. According to newspaper accounts from the time, he spoke about wanting to see black Americans given a fair chance, expressed regret over the hostility of the past, and reportedly accepted a bouquet of flowers from a young black woman in attendance, a moment that scandalized white Southern newspapers when word of it spread. Historians disagree sharply about how sincere any of it was, whether it reflected a genuine change of heart or simply a man near the end of his life trying to rebuild what was left of his reputation. By then, his fortune, the one he'd built before the war, was largely gone, lost in failed post-war business ventures. Forrest died in October 1877 from complications of diabetes at 56 years old, in financial ruin. Whatever that 1875 speech meant, it didn't undo Fort Pillow, and it didn't undo the Klan. It's simply part of the record, as contested and unresolved as almost everything else about the man. In the end, the Union war machine proved unstoppable. Sherman took Atlanta, marched to the sea, and helped break the Confederacy's back for good. But even in total victory, the memory of Forrest never fully left him. Years later, reflecting on the war, Sherman was recorded saying something remarkable about the man he'd once wanted hunted down at any cost. After everything, he said, he believed Forrest was the most remarkable man the Civil War produced on either side. Think about what that admission actually means. This wasn't a passing enemy Sherman brushed off. This was the architect of total war, a man who commanded 100,000 troops and stared down Confederate legends without blinking, conceding that one self-taught cavalry officer, a man with no formal training and no army worth mentioning next to his own, had been the single most dangerous adversary of the entire conflict. Forrest carved out a legacy as the one commander who could make the architect of Union victory look nervously over his own shoulder. But it's a legacy split straight down the middle. Tactical brilliance on one side, forever shadowed by Fort Pillow and the white hoods of the Klan. He was the man Sherman feared on the battlefield, and after the war, he became something else entirely, a symbol of hatred America is still reckoning with today. If this story of the one man who genuinely rattled Sherman is new to you, drop a comment and tell us what stood out. And if you want more of these buried confrontations from the war, the names and moments most textbooks never gave their full weight, subscribe, because there are more of them coming.